Well, hey there, I'm Joshua Johnson. It's great to be with you on this Friday, March 25th. Here's some of what we're talking about tonight. President Biden visits American soldiers on the border of Ukraine and Poland, while Russia seems to be signaling a change in strategy. We'll explain what that is and consider whether the president's trip to Europe was a success. How is the strategy to end this war evolving? Will the latest sanctions stop Russia's aggression? We'll put more of your questions to our experts next. Then Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas is under more scrutiny for his wife's political activism. She reportedly pushed for overturning Joe Biden's presidential win. What does that mean for the justice, especially if he hears election cases? And the Oscars are this Sunday, but moviegoing has changed a lot. How much longer will we spend time and money at a theater near you? So who has the upper hand in Ukraine right now? It's hard to say for sure, but there are some signs that Russia is facing setbacks. According to the Pentagon, the city of Kherson is once again contested territory. Kherson is just north of Crimea. It was the first major city Russia commandeered in this war, and apparently it's in play again. Also today, Russia's defense ministry seemed to suggest a shift in strategy. It claims to be focusing on, in its words, liberating the Donbas region in eastern Ukraine. U.S. officials say they do not know at this point what Russia's strategic plans are. And all of this comes as President Biden was visiting U.S. soldiers in Poland near the Ukrainian border. We'll have more on that in a moment. Meanwhile, we got more information on last week's bombing of a theater in Mariupol. Officials there now say that one attack killed as many as 300 people. Video of the aftermath shows survivors covered in dust. Then there is the northern city of Chernihiv. It's a short drive from there to Kyiv, where Ukrainians continue to flee Russian bombings. Now, our partners at Sky News have spent the past 2 days trying to get into Chernihiv. Fair warning, our first report tonight is very intense. If the sight of blood bothers you, it may be really hard to watch. With that said, here's Alex Crawford.
Chernihiv's being bombed relentlessly. We're with a convoy taking in aid and hoping to reach those still there. This is the last route in or out, and it has to be done fast, across an open farmer's field where every vehicle can be a target. The city's surrounded on 3 sides by Russian troops at this point, and there's a stream of cars ferrying the civilians out of the combat zone. The window to get across the last remaining pedestrian bridge across the Desna River is rapidly closing. But the Russians have spotted this escape route, and minutes after we arrive, they hit it. Okay, the shelling is very close. Get out, everyone's get out.
He said get out, get out, get in. Get in from here.
Stop, no, I don't. It's okay, don't worry. There's a mad scramble to get out as the attacks keep on coming.
All right, go, now. Let's go.
The Russians have used this tactic repeatedly in this war.
100 meters away to the...
The last thing you want to do is have an accident.
Yeah.
Lines of civilians lay on the ground as the shelling goes on and pick themselves up to walk through these bombings. They've no option. Only chance and a prayer will get them through this. There are scores of people trying to flee, with bags on their backs. They're guided through the fields by soldiers whose guns are no match for this heavy artillery. They've been living without heating, food, water or electricity for weeks.
Everyone, come and go from this way.
The Russians have cut off Chernihiv now and destroyed the only corridor out, and they're targeting those trying to escape their bombs and rockets. Inside Chernihiv, the mayor has managed to film some of the destruction. There are bombed houses and buildings on fire everywhere. There are still an estimated 150,000 people trapped inside this city. It's strategically important because it stands right across the northern route chosen by Russia for its advance on the capital. We cannot cope with all the dead, the mayor says. It's carnage. We take refuge in a gym in a basement with a group of volunteer soldiers. Everyone who has made it out of Chernihiv has withdrawn to nearby villages, themselves coming under bombardment. This gives the volunteer soldiers time to make phone calls home. 1 month on, fighting this war, their families and children are mostly well away from the chaos and death they're seeing here on a daily basis. My heart is just breaking, one father tells us. It's very difficult because I'm so used to being with my family. They're my whole life. Away from their own families, they're saving the lives of others. How important is human life, another says. What could be more important than the lives of little children, little girls and boys? Nothing's making us do this. This is just what we have to do. Daybreak the following morning, and they're trying to work out how to get aid into Chernihiv and the civilians out. The last route has closed and is clearly still being targeted. One paramedic asks us for help. He's Yuri, and he tells us the bridge crossing point where he was waiting to help casualties has been shelled 15 minutes earlier. Now he is wounded. He's been deafened by the blast, it was so close, and he's got several shrapnel wounds. Bits have lodged in his leg, and he needs surgery. There's little that can be done on a roadside, but one of our team does what he can.
Where from you? British.
And shrapnel appears to have punctured his lung. He says he's finding it hard to breathe. Targeting of civilians and non-combatants like medics is a potential war crime. I went there all on my own, Yuri tells us. And I saw destroyed cars, destroyed civilian cars. They were all burned out. They were completely destroyed. And there was one dead civilian with his bags.
Okay, guys, good luck.
Yeah, good luck to you. He leaves to try to get to a hospital with this parting message for the world.
I need our country, need your help. Good luck.
Nearby, a farmer's field has been littered with the remains of cluster bomb rockets fired from a multiple rocket launcher. We've consulted several independent experts, including the investigative group Bellingcat, who've identified them as cluster munitions. They're being used by both sides in this war, but the angle suggests they've been fired from Russian positions. The United Nations is investigating the use of cluster bombs as possible war crimes. From inside Chernihiv, they fear they're the next Mariupol. They're trying to create as big a humanitarian disaster as possible, one Chernihiv official tells us. Because they can't get the city militarily, they're trying to force us to give up this way. There are constant sirens warning of attacks on the surrounding villages. And those desperate to leave know every movement comes with risk, including the buses taking them out of here, which they patch up hurriedly. This was hit when it was full of escaping women and children. Chernihiv is really being hit by tank fire, being hit by jets, he tells us. Some people haven't been able to get out for 2 weeks. Those who've made it out talk of a nightmarish existence. It's hell there. It's hell, this mother tells us. My children's godmother is still there. It's not possible to leave the shelter. There's no food, no gas, no electricity. It's just like Mariupol. Everyone's cut off. They're distraught and terrified. Chernihiv used to be so beautiful, she says. The rituals of death are crammed in between the shellings as those left behind struggle to live. For those here, this isn't real living, it's just surviving. And those trapped in Chernihiv cannot know how much longer they can hold out. Alex Crawford, Sky News, outside Chernihiv.
Let's continue now with more answers to your questions about the war in Ukraine. Joining us tonight are retired U.S. Army Colonel Jack Jacobs, a Medal of Honor recipient and an NBC News military analyst, and Angela Stent, senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. She's also a senior advisor to the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies at Georgetown University. Welcome to you both, and I wonder if we might start with a few questions on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. Steve wrote, My understanding is that Ukraine had roughly 44 million people. 3 million people have now fled. Where are the other 40+ million people, and what is their presumed fate? Good question, Steve. Angela Stent, I wonder what your sense is of what people are dealing with in Ukraine right now, particularly those people who can't get out.
Sure. So we think that there are at least 10 million internally displaced people in Ukraine. So some of them have left, you know, the desperate situation they were in Mariupol, Chernihiv. We've just seen other cities, and they're in other parts of Ukraine. They're moving around. Of course, I think by now there may be up to 4 million refugees have left Ukraine. And then the Russians, we know, have deported some people. They've taken people and put them in buses and taken them to Russia, and we don't know what's happened to them. So there is a lot of movement. And obviously some people are still staying in the cities, but I think the IDP, the internally displaced people, is a real problem and will only get worse.
Before we continue with questions with regards to people who have gotten out of Ukraine, we have some breaking news with regard to an American who had been detained in Ukraine by Russian forces. This comes to us from the office of Minnesota Democratic Senator Amy Klobuchar about a young man by the name of Tyler Jacob, who is a native of Winona, Minnesota, which is southeast of Minneapolis, right on the state line with Wisconsin on the Mississippi River. We are told that he had been living in Ukraine and was unjustly detained by Russian forces, but has left Russian custody and is now safely with his wife and daughter. According to the statement from Senator Klobuchar's office, he was taken by Russian forces 2 weeks ago while leaving Ukraine, was then detained in Russia, not in Ukraine, but in Russia, which of course borders Ukraine, and held for 10 days. The senator says her office has worked closely with Tyler's family, the State Department, and the U.S. Embassy in Moscow to locate him and help bring him to safety. The statement does not say anything about how Mr. Jacob was treated in his custody with Russia. Presumably, he is alive and well, having been released, but we have no further details from just this statement on how he's doing. But again, good news for this young man and his family. Senator Klobuchar says Tyler Jacob of Winona, Minnesota, which is southeast of Minneapolis, has been released from Russian custody. He had been living in Ukraine and is now back safely with his wife and his daughter. Colonel Jacobs, before we continue with audience questions, I know I'm just reading this to you for the first time, but what about that? I mean, in terms of the interface between the U.S. and Russia on matters like this, thankfully, there are lines of communication, at least still some diplomatic lines, wherein the U.S. and Russia can work something like this out.
Well, our embassy is still there, and it's still in operation, although Putin ejected a number of our diplomats some time ago, but it's still in operation, and we're still the normal run of diplomatic issues continues to be exercised by our embassy in Moscow and our consulates as well. That hasn't changed very much. The tenor of the relationship, of course, is very much different now, Joshua.
Angela Stent, let's continue with a question about the U.S. position on refugees. Here is what Tracy left in our inbox. Listen.
What's going to happen with our immigration, asylum, and refugee policies for Ukrainians?
Tracy, someone that we met in Washington Square Park not too long ago, and of course the U.S. has said it will take in up to 100,000 refugees. That news came in the last few days. Angela, what do you think that might look like from a policy perspective?
Well, by the way, most of these 100,000 people, I think, are supposed to have relatives in the United States. I think it's great that we're taking them. It's too bad that we can't take more because the Europeans, of course, bearing the brunt of all these refugees. But hopefully these immigrants will be welcome in the United States after all of the traumas that they've been through. And so I think 100,000 is a good start, and maybe we'll take some more going forward.
We got a number of questions, Colonel Jacobs, from people about how to help out. Here is what Cheryl and Zadig wanted to say. Watch.
I just wanted to say I wish I could go help Ukraine. I'm 68 years old. I have a sciatica problem, stupid stuff. Anyway, I would love to go help people.
I'm 12, and I wanted to know, why can't we immediately address the fact that Ukraine needs help.
First of all, can I just tell you how honored we all are that a 12-year-old decided to call in and leave a voicemail and ask how they can be of help. Colonel Jacobs, what would you say, especially to that 12-year-old, but to everybody who feels like they wish they could do something?
Well, there are charities I know that are rendering assistance, particularly medical care, medical supplies and the like, to Ukraine from the United States. I can tell you that from a military standpoint, however, the thing that Ukraine needs the most are things like ammunition, small arms and automatic weapons, anti-tank weapons, anti-aircraft weapons, and they need food. And it's very much, it's important that the United States and our Western allies gets this stuff to them as quickly as possible. It seems to be good news that it's possible that the Russians are now focusing on the east. All of us were very much concerned about the possibility of the Russian forces linking up. I think this is what they wanted to do, link up in the middle of the country, cut it in half, and prevent the kinds of things I'm talking about from getting resupplied to Ukrainian forces, particularly in the east. So it's that the Ukrainians need more than anything to defeat the Russian forces. And so far, it seems to be that there's at least a stalemate and maybe a turnaround in the impetus of the battle. Joshua.
Angela, we got plenty of questions about Vladimir. Oh, go ahead, Angela, go ahead.
I just want to say something to the 12-year-old. You know, there are even organizations that are collecting clothes and things like that, and food. So you and your friends can do things, find out it's your church or some other organization, and they can help get some of those supplies to Ukraine.
Yeah. If you're watching tonight, by the way, thank you for asking. So proud of you for picking up the phone and asking the question and knowing that we would hear it and answer. We really, really, really appreciate it. Angela, we got a lot of questions, continually get questions about Vladimir Putin. Aaron describes himself as a conservative and had this assessment of how he felt that President Biden has dealt with Russia's president so far. Here's what Aaron had to say.
I believe he did a great job on this aspect of his presidency. I don't agree with much of what he does or what the administration does, but I will give him kudos for his handling of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Open to any suggestions if you or any of your panelists believe that Putin was or is trying to draw the U.S. into a war by invading Ukraine.
Aaron, thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. Angela, what about that? Is this a way to basically use Ukraine as a proxy to pull the U.S. or other Western powers into something bigger?
Well, first of all, I would agree that I think President Biden has done a very good job of getting the allies, getting unity, and dealing from a position of strength with Putin. So Putin believes that he's at war with the United States. He sees Ukraine as a sort of proxy for the U.S., but he's not trying to get into a direct war with the United States. I think what he would like to do is to show that NATO really isn't as much as it's supposed to be, or to use an old Chinese phrase, it's a paper tiger, that he's going to try and provoke something that could involve a NATO country like Poland, like one of the Baltic states, and then see how NATO reacts. And that's why the president of the other NATO countries, they met yesterday, they're being very careful not to let themselves be provoked. But yes, Putin believes he's at war with the U.S.
Colonel Jacobs, a number of the other questions had to do with our tactical stance, the U.S. tactical stance on dealing with Vladimir Putin. Ricardo emailed, how come the U.S. had a military plan to kill Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden, but is afraid to do the same with Putin? And Jaker tweeted, I'm hearing some people asking Russians to remove Putin. If he was removed, who is next in line behind Putin? I just want to be clear, we're talking about assassinating a world leader that is sitting on significant supplies of energy and a bit of a nuclear stockpile. So, Colonel, I don't know if that changes the calculus or not, but how do you see it?
Well, it sure does. I mean, my answer to the first question would be exactly that. I mean, one of the major differences between Putin and Saddam Hussein is that the former has nuclear weapons and lots of them, and designs on Europe, and Saddam Hussein didn't. No, I don't think, I agree with you. I don't think we're going to go after Putin He's got plenty of opposition inside the country. The question is whether or not it's going to be mobilized to do something about him. If he were not there, the conventional wisdom is that the Minister of Defense, Shoigu, would take over. And if he were not there, what in our country would be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Gerasimov, he would take over. But we have to remember this about what takes place inside Russia. All those people, the two people I mentioned, plus everybody else, including the oligarchs, are something of a cabal. They're in control because they're in control and they take care of each other. It's unlikely that any of those people are going to remove Putin unless their own well-being were at stake. And if that would happen, then Putin would be removed, probably only to be replaced by somebody just like him. The fact is that Russia's a 14th century country and it hasn't changed. It hasn't changed in almost 1,000 years. It's not going to change much in the next couple of weeks either.
A few more quick questions before we have to let y'all go, particularly questions about rebuilding. Zandra, I only know one Zandra, so I have a guess as to who this is. Zandra asks, I would like to know what the end game is for Russia if they succeed in capturing Ukraine. Will they attempt to rebuild all that they have destroyed in Ukraine? And Kay asked a similar question. Kay asked, when the Ukraine war is over, how will its infrastructure, commercial and government buildings and housing be rebuilt? Who will have the political will to bear that cost? Angela?
Well, I think if the Russians prevail, and that's a big if, they will still try and get outside help to reconstruct Ukraine. I mean, it's billions and billions of dollars. It remains to be seen how much money they would be willing themselves to put into it. It's not completely analogous, but in the war in Syria, they're now trying to get the outside world to reconstruct Syria. If the Russians do not prevail, if there's a stalemate, if the Ukrainians somehow manage at least to keep half of their country, then I think you would have a huge outpouring from the international community, from the Western world, to help the Ukrainians rebuild their country, because obviously nobody can afford it themselves. But I would just remind you that decades after the end of World War II, there were cities in Ukraine, as there were cities in lots of other parts of the Soviet Union, that were never really rebuilt. So this could take a very, very long time.
We appreciate your help answering some of these questions tonight. Angela Stent and NBC News military analyst Jack Jacobs, thank you both. And look, it's not too late to get your questions answered. Anything at all you want to know, big, small, whatever it is, send it our way for our next panel of experts. And if you're under 18, please get your parents' permission before you call. We are at NBC Now Tonight on Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. Parents, if you do want to call with your kids, feel free together to leave us a voicemail if you like. 888-575-2NBC. That's 888-575-2622. Or email us nowtonight@nbcnews.com. Up next, President Biden is continuing his European trip. And today, that included spending some time with troops in Poland. What has his trip accomplished so far? And what can we expect tomorrow? Plus, we'll hear how UNICEF is helping Ukrainian refugees, especially children. We're glad you're with us for Now Tonight from NBC News. President Biden's push to stop Russia's war in Ukraine continues this weekend with his emergency trip to Europe. Today in Poland, he met with U.S. troops and aid workers. The president sat down for a slice of pizza with the troops, pepperoni and jalapeno. Then he spoke to them about the significance of this moment.
What you're engaged in is much more than just whether or not you can alleviate the pain and suffering of the people of Ukraine. We're in a new phase. Your generation, we're at an inflection point.
Before that, Mr. Biden was in Belgium meeting with the president of the European Commission. They announced plans to reduce Europe's dependency on Russian energy. NBC's chief White House correspondent Kristen Welker has more from Poland's capital, Warsaw.
President Biden spending the night here in Warsaw, Poland, really the epicenter of the refugee crisis, when he arrived here at a town that was less than 50 miles from the Ukrainian border. Earlier today, the president had a briefing along with the president of Poland about the refugee crisis. He also addressed U.S. troops today, telling them that this is a battle of democracies versus autocracies. And he raised some eyebrows when he said this, that U.S. troops are going to see it, meaning Ukraine's resilience, when you're there. That, of course, raised eyebrows because the president has said that U.S. troops are not going to go to Ukraine. So later, a White House official clarifying, saying the president has been clear, we are not sending U.S. troops to Ukraine, and there is no change in that position. Now, this visit to Poland caps a marathon diplomatic session that President Biden had in Brussels when he attended that emergency NATO summit, the U.S. and NATO allies announcing new sanctions against Russian lawmakers, as well as $1 billion in humanitarian aid for Ukraine. And today, the president announcing the U.S. will give Europe more natural gas, an attempt to limit the extent to which Europe is dependent on Russia for its oil. But the big question about all of this is, what, if any, impact will it have on the war in Ukraine? Of course, the U.S. and its allies have imposed several rounds of sanctions against Vladimir Putin, and so far he has been undeterred. President Zelensky of Ukraine has pleaded with the U.S. and Europe for more help, for air support, for a no-fly zone, for Polish MiGs. And so far, those requests have been turned down, in part, the president says, because he doesn't want to escalate the crisis and have it turn into World War III. As for President Biden, he has one more day here tomorrow. He will be meeting with refugees here in Warsaw and then deliver what the White House is calling a significant address about what's at stake.
All right, thank you, Kristen. That's NBC's Kristen Welker reporting from Warsaw. Now, after President Biden's visit with the troops, he was briefed on the humanitarian response in Poland, where he spoke about the children affected by this war.
It's just devastating to see those little babies, little children, and looking at mothers who you don't have to understand the language they speak. You just see in their eyes pain, and I mean literally pain, watching their children. I don't think there's anything worse for a parent than to see a child suffering.
Millions of children have fled this war. Some left their parents behind. UNICEF says nothing on this scale has happened since World War II, and the group has a lot of work ahead, caring for children in the middle of a nightmare.
People are crossing on trains, they're crossing by car, they're crossing on bus, and many are crossing on foot. And they arrive at the border with literally all that they could carry with them, exhausted, cold, wet.
UNICEF says about 7.5 million children lived in Ukraine. The war has displaced more than half of them, about 4.3 million. Joe English of UNICEF says caring for them means providing a little bit of everything.
Given the scale of the crisis, we are having to clear out our warehouses and then rapidly refill, bring in new supplies and work to get them into the country, even from midwife kits, to make sure that children are being born safely, even in the most difficult circumstances, in bunkers, makeshift wards, early childhood development activities, nutrition, making sure that kids have got access to education supplies, water and sanitation, toys for kids, because ultimately we can meet all of these basic needs, but if we're not giving children a chance to have a childhood at the same time, then it's going to have long-term repercussions for them.
Many of these children clearly understand a war is going on, and they hate it.
It's a river of blood, it's loud noises, it's terrible.
We are trying everything to reach children, to reach families, no matter where in the country they may be. But the reality is that if bombs are falling and bullets are flying, we can't get our people in there safely. We need humanitarian corridors. We need these humanitarian pauses in the fighting. If the guns can fall silent and if the bombs will stop falling, we can be in there. But without that, it's going to be very difficult.
Diplomats are trying to negotiate safe passage for humanitarian aid. Many Ukrainians have been demanding a no-fly zone.
Please do something for us. People are saying in Ukraine, please close the sky.
UNICEF and the UN's refugee agency are trying to set up another way, what they call blue dot hubs.
And these are safe spaces along the route, both in registration centres and also at train stations and wherever we're seeing movements of people and people gathering. And they provide children with a safe place to play. They also provide parents with that safe space to know that they can get more information about the services that are going to be available to them in the country that they're in.
The hubs also help connect unaccompanied minors with protection services, and they offer counseling to deal with the traumas of war for parents and kids.
It's hard mentally. You are hoping that you will be sleeping calmly, but you're not sure. You don't know what will happen next. It was scary. I was worried about my father, about my mother, that I left them there. It was scary to hear it, how these bombs were exploding.
The exodus from Ukraine raises the risk of human smuggling, child trafficking, and exploitation.
And so UNICEF has a practical guide in terms of minimizing protection risks for children on the move, both inside Ukraine and in Poland and the surrounding countries. Even if we get the risk down to 1% or 0.1 of 1%, when the numbers are so huge, you're still talking about tens of thousands of children potentially at risk, tens of thousands of women potentially at risk. So the quicker that we can work to identify these most vulnerable and get them the care and services and protection that they need, then we'll be mitigating those risks.
But beyond the basic needs like supplies, counseling, and protection, UNICEF and Ukrainians both say their greatest need is peace.
The bombs are falling down on the city a lot and people are dying. It is so difficult. We just want peace. We want everybody to be alive.
Those efforts to get people out alive are continuing, including a push by French President Emmanuel Macron. He says he is working on a humanitarian operation to evacuate Ukrainians from Mariupol. Greece and Turkey will join France in this operation. President Macron added that there has been, in his words, transparency about the mission with Ukrainian President Zelensky. Mr. Macron also plans on speaking with Vladimir Putin in the next 48 hours to secure the details. Up next, the January 6th investigation now has a tie to Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. The connection? His politically active wife, Ginni. We'll explain. Plus, the FBI says it prevented a bombing attack on a mosque in Chicago. That's all just ahead. Stay close. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas is out of the hospital tonight, but he went from dealing with an infection there to a political headache at home. And it involves his wife, Virginia Thomas, known as Ginni. In the weeks after the 2020 election, she was among those urging the Trump White House to overturn Joe Biden's win. She texted the former White House Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows. There were 29 messages in all, 21 from Mrs. Thomas, 8 from Mr. Meadows. For example, on November 10th, 2020, a week after the election, Ginni Thomas texted, quote, "Help this great president stand firm," and, quote, "The majority knows Biden and the left is attempting the greatest heist of our history," unquote. A source familiar with the January 6th investigation says the committee has these texts. NBC News is awaiting comment from Ginni Thomas and Mark Meadows. Justice Clarence Thomas has not released a statement about his wife's political activity, and it's unclear how all this affects his job, including whether he will recuse himself from cases about the 2020 election. Let's get into all of this with Barbara McQuaid. She's an MSNBC legal analyst, a former U.S. attorney in Michigan, and a law professor at the University of Michigan Law School. Professor McQuaid, good to see you. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Joshua. Great to be with you.
I need you to tell me how much of this story is light and how much is heat. Obviously, the wife of a Supreme Court justice being politically active, there's a lot of potential for attention inside the Washington Beltway. But is this a big thing, or is this just getting our attention because she happens to be Clarence Thomas's wife?
I think it's a very significant story, Joshua. I suppose there's some of both, the fact that she's his wife that gives it some attention, but I think that's part of the reason why it's so disturbing. You read some of those text messages. They're talking about, the greatest heist in history, and this is psychological warfare. We need to engage in psyops. It's really disturbing to think that someone who lives in this country, is that close to a Supreme Court justice, is also so willing to undermine democracy. So I think there's two issues here. One is, does she fall within the scope of the investigation? And does the January 6th committee need to be getting her emails and others to look at her role in all of this? And then the other is the ethical obligations of a Supreme Court justice for the conduct of their spouse. You know, we think of spouses as separate entities, but in most judiciary, parts of our judiciary, the standard for recusal is a judge should recuse if there is any fact that would make their deciding the case put their impartiality into question by a reasonable member of the public. And Supreme Court justices don't have that. They get to recuse themselves, and really the only direct conflict is a financial one. And so I think it calls again into question whether we shouldn't be imposing more strict ethical requirements on our Supreme Court justices.
I just want to underscore what you just said, Professor, so that we don't miss it. It sounds like you said that the rules we would normally think of for judges to say, nah, I got a personal conflict here, I can't hear this case, don't exist for Supreme Court justices in the same way they would exist for judges in other parts of the legal system. Is that right?
It is right. So, you know, Supreme Court justices are supposed to recuse themselves for a direct conflict. So, you know, if your spouse is a party, the defendant or the plaintiff in a case, you'd have to recuse yourself. Or there's some financial interest. You know, they're going to either win or lose a lot of money in this case, and so that would be a basis. But for most judges, there's also this appearance of a conflict standard that also requires recusal. If a person's fairness could be questioned to promote public trust in the judiciary, a judge should recuse himself in that situation as well, and that does not apply at the Supreme Court. And, you know, here's why it matters so much here. If you recall, Joshua, it was just a few weeks ago that the Supreme Court rejected a challenge by Donald Trump to prevent the National Archives from turning over to the January 6th committee White House documents. Clarence Thomas was the only one on the court who dissented from that opinion and agreed with Donald Trump that he could withhold those documents. Was he thinking, like, I need to stop this because my wife's text messages might be in there and that could be embarrassing to her and embarrassing to me? And so I think his impartiality could fairly be questioned in that instance. And that's why I think it undermines public confidence in the court when they're not recusing themselves in these kinds of situations.
I do want to be clear. There's a lot about these text messages that we do and don't know. We're still trying to get the full picture of them, but that's kind of the point of the January 6th Commission, is to get the full picture about the planning around the rally and then the attacks that ensued. Here's another one of the texts from November 13th, a week and a half after the election. Virginia Thomas wrote to Mark Meadows, just forwarded your Gmail, an email I sent Jared this AM. Jared, possibly Jared Kushner? Sidney Powell and improved coordination now will help the cavalry come and fraud exposed and America saved. And then on November 24th, Mark Meadows texted, this is a fight of good versus evil. Evil always looks like the victor until the King of Kings triumphs. Do not grow weary in well-doing. The fight continues. I have staked my career on it. Making some biblical references there, the King of Kings, and then citing part of a Bible verse, do not grow weary in doing good, for at the proper time you shall reap a harvest if you do not give up. Professor McQuaid, it sounds like the issue here is coordination. Virginia Thomas has said she attended the January 6th rally but left before President Trump spoke. But this kind of raises that question of how much she knew and whether she was involved.
Absolutely, and I think the January 6th committee not only it would be within its rights, but I think has a duty now to request her text messages. They got these text messages from Mark Meadows, and remember, he was cooperating for a while once he received a subpoena, and he provided some text messages, and then he stopped. So they have these, and the reporting is that they get a flurry of text messages from her right after the election, and then they abruptly stop at the end of November. They pick up again around January 6th. Did he decline to produce those because he decided to change his mind and not cooperate anymore? Or did he decline to produce those because they were really bad and he doesn't want to share them with anybody? And that's what caused him to stop his cooperation. I think we'd like to see them. So one thing that the committee ought to do, I think, is subpoena her text messages. These came from Mark Meadows, so let's hear what she has to say. And you know what else, Joshua, this reminds me of? If the Justice Department were involved here, they wouldn't have to rely on Mark Meadows or Ginni Thomas to produce their own text messages because they could use a search warrant to go get them from the provider. I like to think that they're investigating and perhaps either doing that or contemplating doing that. But I think at the very least, the January 6th committee needs to see what the rest of these text messages had to say. Let's see the one that she sent to Jared Kushner, if that's who the Jared is.
Very briefly, Professor, last question. It's not a crime to believe that Joe Biden is not the duly elected president. It's false, but it's not a crime. It's not a crime to believe that God ordained Donald Trump to remain the president of the United States. It's religiously questionable, but not a crime. So it sounds like for this to actually amount to anything legally, there's got to be real clear causal connection between Ginni Thomas and what happened at the Capitol on January 6th. Do I have that right or not before we go?
Yes, I'm not sure. So I agree with you that there needs to be fraudulent intent. And so far, it looks like she truly believed that the election was stolen, maybe. But you would have to believe that you knew the election wasn't stolen, and yet you pushed hard to oppose the certification. And so I don't think you need to connect her to the insists. I think you just need to connect her to the pressure on Mike Pence to abuse his power to certify the election.
Michigan law professor Barbara McQuaid, it's always good talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joshua. Same to you.
In some of our other stories tonight, 3 people face charges for allegedly planning to blow up a Chicago area mosque in the name of ISIS. The FBI says Xavier Pelkey from Maine coordinated with 2 teenagers over Instagram. The attack would have targeted a mosque during spring break. The teens are from the Chicago area and from Kentucky. Newly unsealed court documents show they plan to separate the adults from the children inside and then kill the adults. Officials say they plan to target a Shia Muslim mosque in the name of ISIS, and ISIS presents itself as a Sunni Muslim group. The FBI arrested all 3 suspects last month. Agents found handmade explosives in Pelkey's apartment. He faces up to 10 years in prison. The teens are both minors, so their charges have not been made public. It's easy to yearn for the good old days, especially in the film industry. Moviegoing is not what it used to be. But what will that mean for this Sunday's Academy Awards? We'll consider where Hollywood is headed before we go. So have you made your list of Oscar predictions yet? Do you even care? It's a cultural shift that has some in Hollywood worried. Now, nothing celebrates the magic of the movies quite like the Oscars. The event is this Sunday. But what role does Hollywood's biggest night play these days? According to Nielsen, viewership has been declining for years. Look at the chart, especially after the 2010s. Last year, 10.4 million people watched the Oscars. That's down 56% from the year before. Now, COVID obviously was a huge part of the problem, but the Oscars also has the reputation for elevating more critically acclaimed films rather than the big money blockbusters. Check out the 10 nominees for Best Picture of the Year. The New York Times noted that when the Oscar nominations were announced, 9 of these 10 movies had made less than $40 million in the domestic box office. Now compare that to a movie like Spider-Man: No Way Home. That's been out for 3 months, and it grossed almost $800 million just in the U.S. NBC Entertainment reporter Daniel Arkin joins us now to discuss this. And Daniel, I wonder what the Academy's sense is of what's going on here. I mean, Hollywood is still making money on movies, and it's still handing out the prestigious Academy Awards. So is this more of a perceived problem in the public, or do the people who do the Oscars think there's something wrong?
Good evening. Thank you for having me. I think you can get the impression, based on what the Academy has been doing in recent months, that they feel that there is a crisis here that needs to be fixed. For example, in the last couple of years, the producers of the Academy have floated the idea of introducing a so-called popular film category. That would be a space for them to recognize blockbusters from Marvel or DC rather than some of the more artsy or critically acclaimed films that have smaller audiences. That idea has always been rebuffed and nixed. They have talked about shortening the show. Controversially, they moved 8 of the technical or so-called below-the-line categories to the commercial breaks, which means they will not be presented live. That caused a lot of consternation in the film industry, but it's another indication that they seem to think they need to make the show more accessible and more populist. And that would be a way of stemming some of these ratings losses we've seen over the years.
How much of this just has to do with the changing economics of the movie business? I mean, we put that list up of the 10 Best Picture nominees. If you look at that list, a lot of these films either came from non-traditional movie studios, not the big 5 or 6 studios we're used to, or they were released in non-traditional ways. Coda is from Apple TV+. Don't Look Up was on Netflix. Power of the Dog was on Netflix. King Richard came out on HBO Max the same day that it came out in theaters, and on and on and on. You know, Dune came out on HBO Max the same night. West Side Story's on Disney Plus now. You know, very few of these are conventional movie releases. So I wonder how the adapting business of Hollywood is affecting the role of the Oscars these days.
I think we're living in an environment where it's very hard to gauge the commercial success of a film or even how many people tuned in. For example, any film that streams exclusively on Netflix, HBO Max, Disney Plus, those streaming platforms are not in the habit of disclosing viewership data. It's not like the weekly box office reports where people can pore over data and figure out precisely how many people bought tickets to X title at X location in the US. I think another thing we've seen here, obviously, we are in the midst of a 2+ year pandemic that has meant that the box office potential of films like West Side Story, King Richard, was necessarily limited. A lot of older audiences who tend to be the target for films in those genres were more reluctant to return to the multiplex, and they stayed home.
I'm trying to suss out whether or not this argument over the future of Hollywood is really a thing. Every single major mass medium, radio, television, legit theater, broadcast television, cable television, has all gone through these reinventions, and companies have found ways to adapt. Take our company, for example. We have one nominee for Best Picture, Belfast, which is distributed by Universal, which is a corporate cousin of NBC News. I don't think anybody at Universal Pictures is counting on Belfast for the bottom line of the company, because they've got Marry Me and Sing 2 and all these, the Bad Guys is about to come out from DreamWorks. Like, it feels like it just doesn't matter that much necessarily in terms of the company being able to pay the bills every year.
You may have seen early this morning, the New York Times ran an op-ed by the writer Ross Douthat that effectively proclaimed the end of the movies as a social
we saw
and cultural
That's what started this whole
centerpiece.
conversation for us in our show team.
The headline. There's a lot in that column that is worth debating and discussing. I do think it's fair to say that American films do not occupy the same space in the culture that they did, say, 20 years ago. Just for example, the year that Titanic won Best Picture, 1998, some 55 million people tuned into the Oscars. It was a massive audience befitting the celebration of a film that was a gigantic commercial and critical spectacle. The Oscars audience has never come close to that total ever since. So again, I think it's fair to say that films, very generally speaking, are not at the center of our cultural life. They are now jockeying for attention in a marketplace that includes everything from video games to whatever's happening on your TikTok stream to the news. There's any number of media and entertainment options available to us. I think another thing to point to is the rise of what many people refer to as prestige TV. I think it's fair to say that a lot of projects that would have traditionally been conventional 2-hour feature-length films released in theaters are now being routed to Netflix, to HBO Max, to Hulu. And they are taking the form of serialized miniseries like Mayor of Easttown or The White Lotus. I think that's another shift that can't be overlooked. Middle class and upper middle class consumers who used to go to the movies on a Friday night and have date night, a lot of those people are now staying home, binging these serialized shows that have, in some cases, the same caliber of star cinematography that at the very least resembles filmmaking. I think that's a shift that can't be overlooked.
Yeah, I am personally very much looking forward to going to the movies this weekend just because I haven't been in so long and I need to get out of the house. NBC entertainment reporter Daniel Arkin, we appreciate you making time, sir. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
Hey, before we go, plenty of today's hit movies have an actress in the leading role, a woman as the lead. But how many of those movies have a woman leading behind the camera? A new UCLA report found that last year, just over a fifth of directors of streaming or theatrical movies were women. A fifth. That's 5 times what it was just 10 years ago. But at this Sunday's Oscars, the number of nominees who are women is at a 3-year low. NBC's Hallie Jackson has that story.
The 94th Academy Awards are this Sunday, highlighting Hollywood stars, including, of course, women. But this year, only 28% of Oscar nominees are female, the lowest in 3 years.
Do you think there's still a glass ceiling in Hollywood?
Well, if we look at the data, the answer is yes. But women are breaking through all the time.
Jermaine Franco is the first woman to score a Disney animated movie and the first Latina to be nominated for Best Original Score for Disney's Encanto.
We have to celebrate that women have ideas, women have ability, and we can speak up and we will be heard.
Franco stressing the need to celebrate women of color with a new report out that says Latino and Latina actors are underrepresented on screen, with just 7.5% of all film roles going to them.
What do you say when they look at you and look around and say, I don't see many people who look like me in this industry?
Well, I say, keep your head down and do great work. Don't be afraid to share ideas. If you're going to be in the room, be in the room.
The numbers show there's still a long way to go. According to one report, of the 250 top grossing films of 2021, 82% didn't have a female director, 92% didn't have a female composer, and 94% didn't have a female cinematographer.
I think people tend to associate like more powerful jobs in the film industry with men.
And a 2020 Forbes report showed the 10 highest paid actresses made less than half of what their male counterparts made. There's a focus on creating equity behind the scenes, too. Frankie Fortunato is a post-production coordinator who started her career working long days on the sets of productions like The Greatest Showman and The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. After 3 years, she felt burned out.
I was working 80, 90-hour work weeks. I wanted to care for myself and getting enough rest, and also like seeing my boyfriend, my partner, my family, like being on set. That wasn't possible.
Do you feel like as a woman in film, this is a sustainable career path for you right now?
You know, I mean, I'm not planning on having kids anytime soon, but I think I'd have to have a really big think on it. I have female bosses right now who do have kids. Sometimes they're working later because they have to feed their kids dinner, put them to bed.
Both she and Franco say for women, making yourself seen and heard is key.
What would it mean to you to have that Oscar statuette, to hold that and to know that you earned that?
You know, I really haven't thought about that, actually. I just need to say to young women, you are who you are, and embrace that and go forward with your passion. That's what I feel like is the best win, is that people see that we are contributing and hearing our voices.
That was NBC's Hallie Jackson reporting. Be sure to watch Hallie Jackson Now weekdays on NBC News Now. Thanks for making time for us. Keep sending us your questions on the war in Ukraine on social media by voicemail or by email. Until we meet again, I'm Joshua Johnson. Enjoy your weekend, and we'll see you Monday. Good night.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.